Good morning. I want to challenge you with a little more radical perspective this morning. And it's about a perception that I have about our students and about the world in which they are living. But before I make that observation, I want to state something that is going to be obvious to those that are older, those that are my age, and maybe a little harder to comprehend if you're a younger starting out teacher. And it is this. The world in which the older among the audience, so I'm talking about people in their 50s and 60s like me, the world in which we grew up in was a very, very different world. Now, there's nothing radically insightful about that. It's obvious. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. The world was changing in dramatic ways at the time. And in some respects, it was a simpler world. It was a world that was free from the intrusion of media. I remember the pleasure of going outside in the summertime and spending all day long in the outdoors, not coming home except for meals, and having freedom to roam in my community without any supervision at all. Sometimes getting into trouble, but surviving and being here to tell the tale at 61 years old. The world in which I lived was a world in which I would suggest the country that I lived in, Canada, still very much had a rooting in Christian influences. Whether it was a Christian country or not is up for debate. And at the time, if you know anything about Canadian history, there were radical changes happening in our country. We had the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. We had a real move toward secularization, popularity of left-wing thinking in universities. Although the majority of Canadians still believed in a set of values that were influenced by Christian ideals. And I remember in particular heading off to university, late 70s, early 80s, and being in an atmosphere of open inquiry. Although speaking up and acknowledging that you're a follower of Jesus was sometimes mocked, other times responded to with some hostility. When I was in university, at the University of British Columbia, I was involved in InterVarsity. I was also involved in Campus Crusade, and I regularly went out with friends to tell others about Jesus. But nobody ever told me I had no right to speak. In fact, the university at that time prided itself on being a place where you could say anything to anybody. And everyone was willing to defend everyone's right to say whatever they wanted to say. So therefore, when I spoke up in a history class, or when I spoke up in a psychology class, or even more in a philosophy class about biblical worldview, I might have experienced rolled eyes, and some people's opinion of me might have changed to the negative, but nobody ever told me to shut up. Nobody ever said, you can't say that. People understood that because they were university students, they were sophisticated enough to be able to tolerate ignorant people like me. And the cool part was that in the course of sharing Jesus with others, especially in my final year at UBC, we saw an enormous number of people come to Jesus. Some were people of other faiths, some were people that were ardent atheists, but we really experienced God move in powerful ways. And I remember my final year of university as being an incredible time of just watching God bring people out of darkness into his light. Now, I want to suggest to you that university atmosphere is not there anymore. I want to suggest to you that university students are much more fearful than the students that I went with, whether they were believers or not. I want to suggest to you that I think our kids increasingly are very, very careful about everything that they say and everything that they write. The wild west of social media that existed, I would say about 10 or 15 years ago, where, everybody said whatever they wanted, doesn't exist anymore. Kids today are extremely careful about what they say. And there's good reason for it, because they know that they don't live in an era that tolerates any point of view anymore. In fact, they understand that if they say the wrong thing, they could pay a very, very high price for saying the wrong thing. they could be, as we say, canceled, or they could simply lose their status, lose their friendships. So our kids are living very fearfully. In fact, I'm going to suggest, and this is my radical idea, they're living under oppression already. You see, one of the big things that we talked about in university was the horror of totalitarianism. Although there were certainly strong sympathies toward Marxist ideas when I went to university, nobody romanticized what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time or what was happening in China at the time. The sense was that those countries represent a poorly realized form of Marxism, in fact, an incomplete form of Marxism. And if we could just practice it in its pure form, we would have a great society and we deal with inequality and everything else. We did not look positively at any kind of society that basically sent people to prison for what they thought. And we took books like 1984 very seriously. But our kids, our children, the ones that are in high school, the ones that have moved on from our school and gone on to university, are increasingly living in the reality of 1984. Now, here's the crazy part, though. They don't have Big Brother out there. There's no government agency that's actively monitoring them. It's much worse. What they have is Big Other. What they have is an amorphous, ill-defined reality that is acting as an oppressive reality in their lives. What they have is a mechanism that exists today that has developed somewhat organically. It isn't as if a group of people in Switzerland in some faraway mountain have conspired to bring this about, as some people would like us to believe. I've worked on a global level and I've worked with politicians to know most of them don't have a clue what they're doing. They're just trying to figure it out like all of us. But I would suggest that all of us would agree that there is an enemy of our souls. There's a conspiratorial reality in our world, but it's the spirits and principalities that are behind it all. It's not necessarily a small cadre of political leaders. And they're the ones that are driving the narrative, that are driving what's happening around us. And they're creating this oppressive reality for our kids. But of course, the good news is, above them is our God. And our God told us that as we got closer to the final days, we would experience a global totalitarianism, which I think is already here in spirit. I think our kids already feel it. I think our kids already taste it. See, I don't, because my experience of the world is entirely different than our kids. And because I grew up in that freer era. And the reality is most of my friends, most of the people that I relate to are still very much free thinkers, are still very much okay with what's, with liberal democratic values. And in fact, we all look at what's going on in social media and among our kids and can't really get it. Well, can I help you to get it this morning? Can I help you to get it by understanding that already your kids are living in a very oppressive world? They're already feeling fear. They're already knowing that they can't say whatever they want. So what are the implications of this for us as Christian educators? Well, awareness is one thing, but doing something about it is entirely different. And I would suggest there are two things that you need to be thinking about quite seriously and actively doing. The first thing is expose this spirit of oppression. Like, help the students in your classes understand that this is going on and that this is actually foretold in Scripture and that they are increasingly going to have to pay a price to be faithful to truth. Not just gospel truth, but any truth. Because it's not only dangerous to talk about Jesus in an explicit way. In a university classroom these days, it's dangerous to talk about certain studies about gender, biology, male and female, that are no longer acceptable opinions at many of our thought centers. And so to be someone who speaks up for truth is going to take a lot of courage. And that courage is going to come from one place, and it is love. Our kids need to know that they are loved by God, that God is in control, that this is not a surprise to him, that his precious children have been living all their lives in places like North Korea and China and Islamic majority countries where being a follower has been extremely dangerous. And we're not anywhere near any of those places at this stage, not anywhere near it. And yet God has been there for them, and God has helped them, and God has given them faithfulness. And then second of all, they need to love their neighbor so much that they're willing to risk themselves and risk their freedoms and risk their comfortable lifestyle in exchange for helping those neighbors find the love of God and find the freedom and the anti-slavery of the gospel. Because without knowing Jesus and without the gospel, we are slaves to sin, slaves to our fallen natures, slaves to the powers and principalities of this world. But the gospel comes to liberate us from all that oppression and to free us. Things are changing very quickly around us, and we need to get more serious in this moment about what our kids are facing. And we need to be ready to speak with greater love, greater urgency, and greater confidence to our kids that the truth is powerful. It will set them free. But in the short term, it's going to cost them to say it and believe it and live it. But it's a price well worth paying. Because the ultimate victims of oppression are not people in jails or people in totalitarian countries, because there are many free people in those places, genuinely free people, freer than the kids that we are dealing with today. No, those who are oppressed are those who are living in fear. Fear of big other. Have a good month.